during every single day of the Trump administration, I will very simply put America first.
Hello and welcome to the world with me, Yalda, and I am in freezing cold Washington, D.C.
And with me, Richard Engel, and I am actually in lovely Lisbon right now, but I've just got back here. It is not freezing cold, but we have a lot to talk about. Obviously, Trump and the world. Trump has now presented himself, his foreign policy, his team, his family. You were there. I was scanning the international reaction. Let's get right to it.
And a reminder to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. And Richard and I love getting your questions. So don't forget to send us your thoughts, your questions. We'll try and answer them here on the podcast. It's at the usual place, theworld@sky.uk.
And we have one today we're going to be addressing about drug cartels and terrorism. So stay tuned for that. Yalda, you were there covering this for Sky, bringing an international perspective, trying to tell people back home what was happening in the U.S. What did you see? What did you think?
Yeah, Richard,
what are your impressions?
First of all, it's -9 here today, and our phones are saying it feels like -17. So everyone is in thermals. This feels like the coldest I've ever known Washington, and I've come here over the years. It just is so cold, to the point where Donald Trump's inauguration, usually outside, on the west front of the Capitol, moved inside the rotunda. And I have to say, initial impressions of it being inside was that it was much more intimate.
So you were able to get a seat in the room.
We were not.
It was hard to get in.
The press was not in the room. There's only 600 people allowed inside the room.
So you watched it from a feed room next door or something?
No, we were still outside. So the guests were nice and warm, and Donald Trump said, it was 75 degrees in here. But for the rest of us, I mean, the American press were inside their studios. We were on our rooftop. And
so you were standing out in the cold for hours and hours.
Yeah,
that's why it's so such
front
a
and
lasting
center
memory
of my mind. But it became about the who's who of the new Trump orbit. And what was really quite striking was obviously the first family in the front row. The tech billionaires, the so-called tech bros, and their partners in the second row, and his cabinet, in the third and back rows. So that gave a very clear sign to the world of, what the world, the American people, should be expecting of this particular administration, and a clear signal of who he's going to prioritize.
It's funny, intelligence agencies always watch things like this in other governments. They look at, it goes back to before, but it was very popular when trying to figure out who was in, who was out in the Soviet Union. The CIA would always look at these pictures, and because the leaders, the Politburo would kind of radiate out in degrees of importance, and the further away from the center you were physically, often meant how significant you were at the moment. And then suddenly people would disappear. It's the same in North Korea. People watch North Korea. I'm not saying the U.S. is North Korea. I'm not saying that Putin's Russia, but that particular dynamic of watching who's standing where in the room is an old practice, particularly when it comes to tight, closed-knit regimes, closed-knit political systems.
Yeah, and if we go by the first Trump presidency, one of the things we know is that people don't necessarily last. He divides and conquers his court. And right now, we're already seeing this kind of tension between the MAGA base, the isolationists, and the tech bros who, in many ways look to the future. And they've all come to D.C.
So did it feel like, I don't want to use the obvious analogy, but I have to. It's kind of, you set me up for it. Did it feel like you, as a member of the press, are now left out in the cold?
No, if you look at, if you watch American media on the TV, whether it's CNN or Fox News, it feels like circa 1860. And I'm certainly not saying that's where America is now, but what I'm saying is it feels so tribal when you look at American media. So when you come in as an outsider to this country, and I feel that foreigners can tell the story of this country so well, coming in from the outside and observing, it's been quite an extraordinary experience. I covered the 2020 election. this is probably my fourth presidential election, going back all the way to 2012, Obama's second term. And, this time has felt quite different, whether it was Trump's inaugural speech, and I have to say, he didn't necessarily bring everyone with him. And it felt like a different season of Trump each time. So he gave you season 1 in the inaugural room, and now we're in season 2. And then, of course, he makes his way to the MAGA base in the Capital One Arena. And you see how performative it is. He is the ultimate showman at the end of the day. He's a salesman. He had those executive orders on the table, for example. And then he had the marker pens, with the stroke of the pen. And then he threw it out like a rock star into the crowd, and they're all cheering and jeering. And
Yeah, everyone wants a Sharpie. Someone called out, "Can I get a Sharpie? Can I have a pen?"
And he says Joe Biden, wouldn't do this. And frankly, I'm not sure how many people would do it, because ultimately he is a performer. He is on show. Whether it was that assassination attempt on his life that grazed his ear, at that rally, he fell to the ground. He got up again, and he understood the optics of that moment. Blood running from his face, fist in the air, chanting "fight, fight, fight," which became the emblem of the rest of the campaign. So
And the song, the Kid Rock song.
Kid Rock song. And Donald Trump, understands all of those optics, and he used it to his full sort of ability over the course of the last few days.
So as an outsider looking in, I couldn't agree with you more. I fit a bit in both worlds because I'm an American, but I always cover foreign affairs. I'm always abroad. I live abroad. I've traveled abroad. I don't cover the United States from the inside out. I cover it from the outside in. So, but as someone who is truly covering it from the outside in, what were your takeaways from what he said in these multiple speeches, the rollout? Where do you think this is taking us, taking America as that outsider looking in?
Well, it's funny. When he gave his first speech in 2017, he basically described it as American carnage, and went back to the whole idea of America first. And I remember at the time, George W. Bush turned around, and I don't know if he said it to Hillary Clinton or who was next to him. He said that was some weird and they can bleep that out because I'm not sure if we can swear on this podcast. I don't think it was American carnage. There were moments of hope where he talked about American exceptionalism, and this is the start of a new dawn in America, and America will be great again. But let's get into, Richard, some of the substance of what he said, because as he promised, and it feels like I've forgotten what, Trump as president feels like, but it does feel like one massive rally all of the time. He's constantly like he's on a campaign rally. And he'd promised to sign a flurry of executive orders. The night before, he hinted that he'd sign over 100. And within 24 hours, that's precisely what he did. Dozens and dozens of executive orders. Everything from cracking down on immigration and the border, which was a centerpiece of his campaign, to January 6th and pardoning up to 1,500 people who were either convicted or had accepted that they had committed a violent crime on that day.
So let's get into the meat of it. And it can be hard to find because, as you say, there's so much. He offloads so often and so in such sort of loud ways. It can be hard to find the substance because it's like trying to drink out of a fire hose. So I listened to. I couldn't sleep that night. I watched everything, and I was watching you. I was flipping the channels. I was watching the Arab channels and the respective. I found it just immensely interesting. And I watched the inauguration speech quite intently, and I read the transcript afterwards because that was at least the controlled part. And I read in there and saw, as it was delivered, a Trump doctrine. Amid all the chaos, I think a Trump doctrine emerged that is pretty clear. And it is America first and America foremost. So America first and foremost. America first at home, and we're always going to think about America, and America foremost among all other nations. We are going to be in charge. We are going to be in charge of particularly our own space. And he talked about the manifest destiny. Now, manifest destiny has a very specific meaning in the United States. And the idea of manifest destiny was that America would reach from one ocean to the next, that it wouldn't stop at the Rocky Mountains. It wouldn't stop at sort of the Mississippi River or some other natural border. It would go all the way to the ocean, and that it would be kind of a comfortably placed country sitting between these two natural frontiers, and that it would be more stable this way. And he talked about manifest destiny, and he talked about expansion. He's the first U.S. president in a century to say that we're going to expand our territory. So when he's talking about the Panama Canal, and manifest destiny, it's like this area, the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, is our space. It's what the Romans used to call Mare Nostrum. The Roman Empire described the Mediterranean as our sea. So he's describing the U.S., we control this area, this is our space, don't go near the Panama Canal. China should not be allowed to control the Panama Canal, which is the entering into our territorial waters, our homeland, which is embraced by the sort of larger American vision of itself. So when people talk about Trump as, oh, he's an isolationist, he's certainly not an isolationist. He wants about expanding, he wants to take Greenland. He said, we're going to take Panama back, renaming the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, and manifest destiny. So if you're Putin, that's really good news for you, because he also has a manifest destiny. He doesn't believe that Ukraine should exist. He thinks Russia should go all the way, as it does, to the Pacific and control the sort of that central landmass of Europe. China has a very similar manifest destiny, that the Uyghurs, shouldn't exist as an independent, cultural identity, and that it should also expand its manifest destiny across its territory, including Taiwan, which it doesn't accept. So it's a kind of a geopolitical view of a hegemonic dominance. We control this area. This is ours. Don't come near it. America first and foremost, and stay out of our territory. And I think that was the Trump doctrine as I understood it.
Yeah, and what's fascinating when you think about who Trump sees as his counterparts, he doesn't necessarily see European leaders as his counterpart. That's why he had so much trouble with the likes of Angela Merkel, for example. Who does he see and respect on the world stage? It's the likes of Vladimir Putin. It's Xi Jinping. And but at the same time, he has rivalry and competition with them. He put that firmly in his national security doctrines the first time round. When we talk about great power competition, he's looking at the likes of China. And so when you're talking about this sort of maritime expansion and Donald Trump not being an isolationist, I think in many ways people misunderstand Trump and where he's coming from, because actually he views these strong men as leaders that he respects, and he also sees as his counterparts on the world stage. And he does have a level of rivalry and competition with them. So he wants to take them on when it comes to American expansion. So you're right. I think when people sort of think, is he joking that he wants to take Greenland? I think, no, actually, it's sort of misunderstanding the point.
I don't think he's joking at all. Also, what people don't miss in sort of the Greenland is the whole Arctic, which is an enormous transitway, and the power issue. We're now entering the world of AI. AI is very thirsty for power. It consumes an enormous amount of power, more than the United States power grid can produce. It's also hot. So I think and all the tech bros, they want to turn Greenland into a battery, giant battery that's cold, that is the brain, that powers the brain, that is AI.
Yeah, and that's why he's launching all sorts of infrastructure initiatives, for example, with OpenAI and Oracle and various others. That's why he's investing so heavily, led by Elon Musk, in the tech billionaires who have come to Washington. I think the marriage between bureaucracy and the sort of tech billionaires, how that will work will be really interesting over the course of the next 4 years. But I think on certain issues and policies, if we break down some of these executive orders, for example, on immigration, it feels very much like he has squeezed 4 years into 24 hours.
So executive orders are exactly what they sound like. It's a way for the executive branch of government to implement a policy or try and implement a policy without going through the normal process. But it's a way for the president to say, this is what we're doing, try and stop me. And it's now up to the other branches of government to try and stop that executive order if they don't accept it.
When he is putting these executive orders in place, for example, and immigration certainly was high on the agenda, saying that he's going to deploy troops on the border, reshaping America's relationship with immigration and how people view that and, whether they can come to the United States and what their role is. And that is what this executive order is now going to do. But I think what we're going to see is a number of things. On the one hand, you're going to see people who have lived illegally in the United States, who have paid their taxes and who are, law-abiding, terrified now about sending their kids to school, for example, because their kids might return home and find that they're not there anymore. Because if there is a rounding up and a crackdown of people. And then there's the issue around, the criminal gangs, the drug cartels, the war on the drug cartels. So it's multifaceted, and it feels like what he was trying to do over 4 years has been squeezed into one afternoon in the Oval Office and on stage at the Capital One Arena.
Why don't we take a break right now? And when we come back, we're going to talk more about Trump and the world. Also, let's talk about Israel, the ceasefire. It's gotten a little bit lost in all of this. I've just come back from there. Let's talk about that when we come back.
Welcome back. Richard and I have been talking about the inauguration of Donald Trump and the changes that we're likely to see over the course of the next 4 years. And of course, we love getting your questions. Please continue to send them through the usual place, theworld@sky.uk. We were just talking, Richard, before the break about the southern border and the executive orders that Donald Trump has put into place. He talked about the war on the drug cartels. We've got a listener here who's sent us an email. It's from Don. And he says, on day one, President Trump designated the drug cartels as terrorist organizations, which seems obvious. But of course, there is pushback. Is that real concern or just petty politics? Why wasn't this done before? What is the downside? Now, first of all, he has signed this executive order to designate drug cartels as terrorist organizations. It's up to the State Department to put them on that list. Now, when we think about the terrorist lists, the designated terrorist lists, we think, Richard, of Al-Qaeda, for example, ISIS, for example. We don't think about Mexican drug cartels or Venezuelan drug cartels. And I think the reason they do that is because they focus on politics and ideology. These terrorist organizations want to attack U.S. embassies, for example. They want to launch attacks on American soil. They want to kill Americans and American partners and allies. Drug cartels don't necessarily,
they want your money. They want your money. They
money.
don't care what happens to you, but they would rather just have your money. If you die using their product, c'est la vie. But they would rather just take your money. They don't want to blow up your shopping mall.
Yeah, they use similar tactics like car bombs, for example, but they are
against each other
targeted
and against their rivals.
Exactly, they are not going after indiscriminately against Americans or launching attacks
you don't kill your
on
customers.
American.
You kill your rivals, or you kill your dealers who cheat you, or whatever.
Yeah, and so I think suddenly putting them on a terrorist list, I mean, what does that mean? Does that mean...
so it has an enormous significance, a technical
But does it mean targeting them in their home countries, doing over-the-horizon attacks?
Yes, it can do that. It automatically triggers a bunch of sanctions. It gives you other kinds of rights to detain. The Ukrainians have been pushing to have Russia as a designated state sponsor of terror. And that was a bridge too far for the United States, because if you do that, automatically a whole series of actions kick into place in the United States. It's a technical term. Look what happened in Guantanamo. We couldn't put these people in an American prison where they would have some rights. But since we're considering them, foreign combatants or enemy combatants, terrorists, they'll fall into this other subgroup of not quite humans, and we can do what you want to them. So it's an interesting sort of fact that you do this. So it means we're really going to go after you, and we can when we're taking off whatever kind of cuffs we might have had bureaucratically to detain, sanction, potentially target with military force. It unleashes every kind of opportunity that you would want.
Yeah, and just on a smaller scale, Richard, someone who supports terrorism in the United States can face up to 20 years in prison, for example. If you're a drug pusher selling drugs on the side of a street in the United
And now they
States, are
say
you
now you're actually
suddenly
part of a terrorist organization. It's a whole different category.
just to answer Don's question there, I think while Donald Trump wants to do this and Joe Biden was pushed to do this back in 2023 and he resisted, I think that there are going to be a lot of agencies concerned about, while this feels obvious to put drug cartels on a terrorist list, it has a whole host of other issues around it.
And think about all these people who are already incarcerated in the United States and in the appeals process. Suddenly they're members of pick a cartel, the Sinaloa cartel or the Zetas or whatever cartel it happens to be. And now they're members of a terrorist organization. It's a different legal challenge.
Yeah, and Richard, just to sort of push it, move it towards sort of where you were in the last week. I was in the Middle East. You were in Jerusalem. We spoke last week about this ceasefire deal, and of course, Donald Trump, took credit for getting it over the line, and I think many people would say rightly so. And certainly the hostage families, when you speak to them, they say that they needed someone to put their foot down and say, we need this done
I spoke
right
to
now.
several hostage families just this week who told me exactly that this deal was basically the same as the deal that could have been there under Biden, but Netanyahu didn't want to do it, didn't want to sign it. There were issues. He was dragging his feet, and he was afraid of Trump, and he signed it. But so some hostage families who say that with great anger, saying they blaming Netanyahu, you could have signed this deal earlier, you just didn't want to, and you only signed it when this bully who you're afraid of said if you don't sign it, there's going to be hell to pay. And there was a lot of anger toward it, but and credit toward Trump. They said because basically the Israelis, that Bibi and Hamas are scared of the guy, so they signed the deal that they could have signed months ago.
And maybe sometimes thuggish language is required in diplomacy, because we've seen Joe Biden, try and convince Israel, try and speak to leaders in the Middle East to try and, get the ceasefire deal over the line. Trump comes in within a few weeks, the same deal that they'd talked about for over a year gets pushed over the line. Now, one of the things that Donald Trump was asked in this impromptu press conference was he confident that this ceasefire deal was going to hold? And he sort of looked up at the reporter, shrugged his shoulders and said, no, I'm not confident. It's not our war. But then he said something quite interesting, Richard. He said that, Gaza, I looked at a picture of that place and it's like a demolition site. You could really build that place nicely. It's got a lot of sunshine this time of year.
It is a lot of coastline.
By the coastline. So it's interesting. We'll have to wait and see.
And you got all this cement. You've got a lot of rubble. Maybe you can use it for landfill, or you can make piers with it.
So he did talk about not being confident about the ceasefire deal, and we're seeing, you've just come back. I mean, there's violence in the West Bank. The guns may have fallen silent in Gaza, but we're seeing a lot of violence continue in the West Bank. And peace in the Middle East is something that every American president comes in and thinks that they can resolve, and they leave office realizing it's more messy than when they first started each time.
So are you asking me, do I think it's going to hold?
Yeah.
I think it's very, very fragile. It's step by step, really slow. So I was there in what is generally called Hostage Square in Tel Aviv, and I've been following this story my whole career, but for the last 15 months plus, since October 7th, it's been a lot of time there. And this rollout is 3 to 4 per week. They're starting with women, then they're going to move to sort of the elderly and the infirm. It's supposed to be children. There's the Bibash family. We haven't seen them come out yet, so there's the expectation that when they do come out, they're probably not alive, and that's going to be very, very demoralizing, because there's this young redheaded 2-year-old, and his picture's still everywhere. And just recently there were Mylar balloons with the number 2 attached to his pictures, because people went out and said happy birthday to this boy hostage, and he hasn't come out yet. And since he hasn't come out, people are starting to wonder, okay, maybe they don't have him anymore. That hasn't been officially said. Once dead bodies start arriving, that's going to be a challenge. I think when I say it's going to fall apart, I could say that with a great confidence that this thing is going to fall apart, but it might come back together again and then fall apart and come back together again. And that could become the new norm for a while, which is still, pretty miserable.
So that is, Richard, your long-term prediction, which is frankly grim. But what is, we do these predictions, these short-term predictions. What do
my
you
long-term
think?
prediction is even grimmer than that. If you want, I'll give you. Here's your tea, Socrates. It's the longer-term prediction is that I think Gaza goes into a state of sort of sustained lower-level war. Where, because there's been no announcement of who's going to run the place. Hamas is still strong. You saw that they're weak, much weaker than they were, but they're still able to do this hostage deal. They were still able to muster hundreds of gunmen, and people were watching. If you saw the videos of the release, they were out in force, and they looked pretty good. They had new cars, and their uniforms were kind of clean and pressed and ready. So they put out the impression that they're still in charge. There's no alternative. So if you have a degree of Hamas there, the Israelis will continue to keep hitting them. And so I think Gaza becomes a long-term, lower-level conflict. And then the focus this year moves to the West Bank. So I think if 2024 was the Gaza year of destruction and hostage and pain and anguish after the intelligence collapse, this year, watch the West Bank.
Well, I guess for me, I'm in DC, and so my focus has been on what Donald Trump is doing and saying, and what people are thinking. And I guess over the course of the next week, I think all of these executive orders that Donald Trump has signed, we're going to see a flurry of court cases and people challenging him on it. And I think one of the things about Donald Trump when he speaks to his base and his supporters is that he makes these threats or promises during campaigns and at rallies. And so it's not so much about getting these things over the line, but appearing before his followers like he's fighting the fight. And I think that's what, he knows that these executive orders are going to prompt, cases, and they're going to make their way to the Supreme Court, and people are going to be talking about it. He knows that's going to happen. It's more that he wants to appear, that to show his supporters, I'm fighting and I'm fighting for you.
Well, another fascinating conversation. We're going to be talking about this a lot, but here's a promise. While we're going to be talking a lot about Trump and the ins and inner workings of his cabinet and the first family and who's in, who's out, the pictures that are coming up and going and coming down and going up in the Pentagon and other halls of power, I still think we need to keep looking around left and right, and I'm looking forward to doing that with you over this wild ride. It's going to be a wild ride.
Yeah, buckle up. It's going to be wild. And I look forward to, continuing this and talking to you, Richard, and getting your perspectives. And as you say, talking about our world.
Yalda, until next time, goodbye.
Richard, always good to see you. See you soon.